Hey everybody, this is Dream, and we have a 12-game early slate as well as a 7-game afternoon slate, which actually features 7 of the 12 games in this particular slate. So this video will be able to be utilized for both of those slates. With that said, I do want to point out that I'm going to do this video a little bit differently than I have been. I'm just going to go through each team and do a team breakdown, game breakdown rather, for each game. We have some games that are pretty high scoring today, though, and a couple games that are low scoring as well. So before I get started, though, can you guys smash that like and subscribe button? It really does help the channel. With that said, let's get into it here. We're going to start with Michigan. Now, Michigan plays Rutgers, who is a 3-point spread on this game. This is a lower scoring game on the slate. Both teams are not particularly great offensively or defensively, though Michigan is slightly better as they do have Hunter Dickinson. So, with that said, let's talk about Michigan here. Dickinson, Buffkin, Jet Howard, and McDaniel all have some interesting upside here. Keep in mind their stats do seem a little bit inflated due to the 3 overtime games that they've had in a row. Williams is also a wild card on this team as he's been sporadic in his minutes since returning from injury, but look for him to get back in the starting lineup at some point. Low scoring game isn't ideal here, but they do have some upside. As for Rutgers, we're going to take a look at mostly Spencer, Amori, and McConnell. Now, Spencer and McConnell have the best upside here because they are priced pretty fairly. Amori is a little bit overpriced, but he's still viable on the slate, though they are all a little bit risky in a lower scoring game on the slate, but they all have some viability regardless of that. So I think this game is probably pretty good for fantasy, despite it being a low-scoring game, since there's some pretty good options available, and neither team is particularly great defensively. For the next game, we're going to take a look at Miami and Wake Forest. We're going to start with Miami. They are favored to win this game by 5 points, and this is a pretty high-scoring game on the slate, actually, which is really nice. It is actually the third highest, or actually second highest on the slate at this point at 157 total points. And Miami is one of the highest scoring teams on the slate at 81 points. As for Miami, they have quite a few good options here. Meyer, Miller, Poplar, and Pack are all great options for a high scoring team. Long has done well against Wake Forest, but he's overpriced today because he hasn't been playing all that well lately. So he would be my 4th or 5th option on this team. And then after that, there's really not too much else. They do play most of their guys a lot of minutes, so that does help. Wake Forest, though, is somewhat decent defensively. They're not great, but they're not terrible. So I do think it's a high-scoring game, though, and it should be a good one. And it should be pretty tight, actually, so I like to see both these teams play well. As for Wake Forest, we're going to look at them. And we're going to look at Appleby and Kinsman as being the decent values on this plate. On this one, Kinsman seems to be getting a bonus here in the last 4 games for starting since due to some other injuries. Hillbreath is a little bit overpriced, but he has some viability, and that's pretty much all for this team. It's going to be a little bit tough for them. Though Miami's not a great defensive team, I do think that both teams will score the ball pretty well, and for the guys that are priced pretty fairly, they should do okay. Appleby's a little bit risky due to his price, but he's got some upside as a result of the matchup anyway. Then we're going to look at Marquette and St. John's. Starting with Marquette here, they are favored to win the game by 7 points. This is the highest scoring game on this big slate, and so they do have some viability here. However, this could be a lopsided game as St. John's is not very good defensively, but neither team is particularly great defensively. They're just average, and neither team is really great offensively either, though Marquette is number 6 in the country, and they have been playing pretty good as of late. So I do expect them to be able to control this game from the start. Kolick, Jones, and Mitchell all have some upside here. Joplin, Iguodaro, and Prosper also look like decent secondary plays on a relatively high-scoring team here in this game, so I expect them all to play well. As for St. John's, we're going to start off looking at Soriano and Wasu, and Alexander. They're the best plays on the team. Now, David Jones and Store have some value, but they carry some risk since Jones comes off the bench here, and Store just it seems like one of the lower scoring guys on the team. But they do have some upside as a result of the game and the tough, despite it being a tough matchup for St. John's, should reveal keep it close enough to make these guys play well, especially since they only really run a six-man rotation. As for Baylor and Iowa State, this game is pretty interesting today. It is a low-scoring game, one of the lowest scoring games, in fact, 134 points. Both teams are below 70 points, which isn't ideal. But for Baylor, I'm really not liking anybody on this team, despite them being a good team. They are a good offensive team, but Iowa State's played pretty good defensively this season, and that's one of the reasons why this game is going to be so low scoring. I just don't see anybody on that team that looks very good. Everybody's overpriced, and it's just a kind of an ugly matchup here. As for Iowa State, you could make an argument for Clasher here, and also for Holmes, and then maybe even Lipsy. But beyond that, there's really not much else. They're very risky just because of defensive battle, and Baylor is one of the better defensive teams in the country. So I don't really advise using anybody from that team on this slate, but if you must, then those are the guys that I would target from this game. The next game we have is the Florida-Mississippi game, Mississippi State game rather. Mississippi State is favored to win this game by 4 points. This is one of the lowest scoring games. I think it's second lowest scoring game on the slate overall, which does make it fairly ugly. It's really hard to like this game, especially for both teams, but Mississippi State does have some upside with Smith and Moore, as they are decent for their price. Jeffries and Matthews also look like high risk plays, but still viable if Mississippi State can pull off the win here. But that's pretty much it for Mississippi State. As for Florida, who are favored to lose the game by 4 points, they are one of the lowest scoring teams on the slate. I think they are second lowest to only Mississippi. Though they do have a couple options here with Kugel, Lofton, and Richards. They do have some upside. Despite being the low scoring team, Richard has the best upside here. Djibouti also has some low-end value upside as a replacement for Castleton, as he's going to play minutes just because they don't really have that much else, and so he does have some viability. But Florida is pretty risky, but neither one of these teams are particularly great offensively or defensively, so I do expect that some players that are priced pretty good to be okay in this game. Then we're going to get into our next game, which is the Providence-UConn game, and this crosses over into the later slate in the day, so if that's all you want, then this is where you want to start paying attention here. For that later slate, we have some more of the high-scoring games here, and this is going to be one of them. UConn and Providence both have some pretty viable on this slate. They both have some players that we could definitely like. We'll start with UConn here, because they are favored by 7 points, and both teams do play pretty good offense and defense, so I do think both this game is going to be decent. Caravan and Jackson look like very decent plays for UConn. Most of the rest of the team do seem a little bit overpriced, but they do have some upside, but not enough for a large slate like this. I think that, beyond Caravan and Jackson, there's not a whole lot that you really want to mess with too much here. As for Providence, they're kind of in an interesting spot as well. Carter, Croswell, and Bynum seem like decent plays in this game. A little bit risky if they get behind by a lot, but they go pretty tight with their lineup, and so I do think they have some viability, especially at the price points. Then we're going to look at the Duke-Pittsburgh game, and starting with Duke. Now, I haven't really liked Duke that much in fantasy much this year, but the way they're playing right now, they are one of the best teams in the country, and Pittsburgh is one of the worst, and this is probably one of the more lopsided games on the slate, despite it only being a 6-point spread according to Vegas. It does have 141 total points, which is not bad, and Pitt is terrible at defense. Duke should be able to run all over them. Lively, Proctor, Roach, and Filipowski all have upside here. They all dominated Pittsburgh before, and even Mark Mitchell has some decent upside on this game. There it is risky because it could potentially be lopsided, but overall, I do think it's an interesting game for both teams, and it looks like Duke finally has some viability in a fantasy perspective, despite being a kind of a streaky team throughout the season. Then we're looking at Pittsburgh. Now they are projected to lose this game, and I do expect them to lose. But Burton and Cummings do have some upside here, and the rest of the team though has a lot of risk, and so I would avoid the rest. But Burton and Cummings both have some unique potential here on this game. Then we're going to look at the Iowa and Ohio State game. Now, this game has one of the highest scoring games on the spread, and that is 155 points, which is, I think, the third highest and the best on the late slate, or on the, I said, the afternoon slate, as it is. With Iowa winning this game by 2 points, both these teams kind of have been struggling as of late, but Iowa has Murray, Perkins, and Sanford having some upside in this high scoring game. I don't expect them to do badly. The rest of the team is a little bit more risky due to their prices being up. And on a big slate like this, there's a lot safer options than some of the others like Rebraka and McCaffrey and others and Ulyss. So I do think Iowa has some viability here, but they're a little bit risky. They are a good offensive team, which is a bonus, and Ohio State isn't playing good defense this year. This kind of both true for Ohio State as well. They play good offense, but not great defense, and Iowa's going to have some problems with Iowa State's offense as well. McNeil and Thornton feel pretty safe on this team. Sensabaugh and Sewing also have some upside, though it is a high-scoring game, so that's going to be beneficial. They do carry a little bit of risk. I wouldn't go much beyond them, but Ohio State plays a six-man rotation, and it's definitely going to play into their favor. As for the next game we're going to talk about is UCLA and Colorado. Now, this is one of the more lopsided games potentially on the slate with the 8-point spread currently in UCLA's favor. Colorado is just happy to be here. UCLA should be able to walk all over them, being one of the better offensive and defensive teams. But they have some viability on this slate. Campbell has been playing really well, and Singleton seems like the best play on the team outside of Campbell. Singleton's getting a bonus due to the fact that they've got a couple dudes out. Jacquez also seems like high risk, but he also has some big time upside potential. But he is pretty risky because he is a little bit inconsistent in the minutes sometimes, especially when they blow people out. But I expect UCLA to win this game going away. And even though it's not the highest scoring game on the slate, it does have some viability here. As for Colorado, it's actually hard to find much on this team to like here, but Hammond is actually a really good play since Simpson is out. He should start. You could argue for some of the other players like De Silva, O'Brien, Levering, and Clifford, as they are priced fairly, but the matchup isn't ideal, and they are the lowest scoring team on the slate for the most part outside of Florida. I think it's Florida. So not a whole lot to like on this team except for Hammond, but he does have some viability with the injury and being a starter now. And he's played really well as a starter despite tough games and things like that. So then we're going to get in the Kansas-West Virginia game. And for Kansas, they are favored to win this game by 3 points. And they really only play like 5 guys. And then one of their starters is actually in danger of missing this game, which is McCullough. If he was to be out, that would really benefit Harris, Dick, and Yusifu. Sorry for butchering your name. They would all be better plays. The first two are good plays anyway, Harris and Dick. And then Wilson is also interesting. Adams is streaky, but sort of interesting today. I would probably stay away from Adams, but the other 4 starters all have some viability on the slate. And they have a nice matchup here against a team that's not really playing very good, which is West Virginia, despite it being a particularly tight game from a fantasy perspective. It should be one of the higher scoring games on the afternoon slate. So I definitely think it's a viable. Kansas is definitely a viable team to pull some plays from, especially if McCullough ends up out. As for West Virginia, we are going to look at them here, and we're going to notice that Mitchell and Stevenson and Matthews look like decent plays. Johnson also has some upside, but hasn't flashed it versus Kansas before, so he is a little bit concerning. But Bell has some low-end value up here as well as a value play. Still a little bit risky since it could turn into a lopsided game, but I do think it's going to be a decent game despite the you know, offense and defensive woes of West Virginia. Then we're going to look at the Tennessee-Mississippi game. And starting with Tennessee, they have the highest spread on the slate at -11 against Mississippi. And they're also the lowest scoring game on the slate. But Tennessee is is a decent team. They also only play about a 6 to 7 man rotation. They aren't very viable here, but Biscovi, Key, James, and Mashak all have some upside today and are fairly priced. So they are get some guys to look at. They also have one injury for the season, which is going to give a boost to James as well. And so I do think that gives them some potential on the slate, especially in the afternoon slate. They're definitely going to be more viable. As for Mississippi, this is a really ugly matchup. They are the lowest scoring team on the slate by a lot, I think. I think Florida is second or third, and then Colorado. Yeah, so but they are priced okay. Brakefield and Burns and Morrell all offer high risk plays here that are fairly priced. I really wouldn't want to use anybody from this team, but if you're just desperate to use some people, those would be the guys to consider. Uh, White also, if he starts, would have some upside, as he feels like an okay value option. Though it's a rough game to pull from just because of the lopsidedness and being the lowest scoring team on the entire slate. But overall, it is still interesting there. And then we're finally going to look at the Oregon-Washington State game. So Oregon is favored to win this game by 2 points. It is fairly low scoring on the slate. They're at 134 points, but it is a tight game. Not much to like about this Oregon team. Dante is the only play that's really valuable here. They tend to play a little bit of a deeper bench, which is not as ideal. And Washington State has actually been a decently defensive team this season, so it's a kind of rough game. Everybody's a little bit overpriced for Oregon, so I would steer clear from them for the most part. As for Washington State, we are going to look at Oregon here, at Bamba as the obvious play with Powell and as another decent mid-range play. Dewey also looks interesting today and should be a tight game, though a little bit low scoring for what we would really like. But especially on the later slate, they are going to have some viability in this Washington State team. Both Washington State and Oregon are not very good teams, and but Oregon is actually a weaker defensive team, and both teams' offenses are just about average. So, with that said, that is my team breakdown for this slate. I'll get into a couple picks that I think are the best options on the slate in general here in just a second. So I just want to say thank you guys for liking, comment, subscribing. Let me know what you think about the format of that. So my top overall plays on the slate are going to be, let's see here, let me get over here. And we're going to start with Soriano, and I'm just going to give you three plays at each position. So Soriano for St. John's. He has some really big time upside today. He's got a nice matchup here, and he's played really well as of late. I really think he's a viable option for St. John's, and looks like a near must play on the slate. Probably the best play on the slate in general. Then we're going to look at here. Hang on one second. I'm sorry. O'Meara for Miami of Florida. He's played really well this season, and he's had some really big games lately. He's been pretty good against Wake Forest in the past, and he should be starting again. His floor is a little bit concerning, but he definitely has some upside here, and so I do think he's viable on the slate. And then we're going to look at, let's see here, who was the next guy? Sorry about that. This will be my last pick for the forwards. Oh yeah, Terrence Williams for Michigan. He is very risky today. He's a high risk, high reward. His minutes have been kind of fluctuating the last few games. Now, he started every game of the season playing over around 30 minutes a game before getting hurt about 6 games ago. And since he's been back, he's played 4 games. His minutes have fluctuated game to game, 22, 29, 19, and 7. I don't know if he's going to end up back in the starting lineup for this game, but he technically should. He's been pretty good all year. But if he starts, he'd be a must play. If he doesn't start, then he's definitely a lot more risky. So do keep an eye on that for that situation. As for the guards, we're going to start with Tyler Kolek for Marquette. Um, he has been extremely good this season. Throughout the year, he's got some nice upside. He's been playing really well. He's also dominated St. John's throughout his career, and so I look for him to have a really good game here. He's had no bad games pretty much all season long, though he is priced all the way up. I think his worst game of the season is like 23 or 25 fantasy points, so he looks like a great option on the slate and has some really good upside. Then we're going to look at two players from St. John's, and Dylan Wasu. Sorry for butchering your name. He also looks like a pretty viable option here. He has a little bit of a low floor, but he's absolutely just dominated Marquette. In the last two meetings against them, he's been over 35 fantasy points, and he makes for a great play on the slate. And then Posh Alexander also for St. John's also looks like he's a near must play on the slate, as he has also dominated Marquette in the past, and his price point is a little bit high, but is pretty viable on the slate regardless. Um, as for, like my favorite value play on the slate is probably Sean McNeil from Ohio State. He comes off the bench, and he plays pretty good minutes, somewhere in the 20 to 25 minutes most games. He's even used to draw starts earlier in the season. He's only had a couple games below 10 fantasy points all year long, and so at $4,000, he is a relatively safe play on the slate and very viable here. And then for another one, we'll give you David Joppin for Marquette. Um, Joplin for Marquette here against St. John's. Just another guy that's been playing pretty well lately. His floor is really low, but he's been in the 15 to 20 point range most of the season in the fantasy perspective. So, and he also gets rebounds, which is nice. So he is viable on the slate. I don't think there's too many, but there's a lot of other guys I could mention, but I would just start going through all the players basically. But overall, I do think the slate is pretty good. Both of these slates, for that matter, are pretty good. So if you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them below. And have a nice day, guys.